Hi.
Sorry I'm a little late. I had to run around. I had to set up my office, which is the closet of my friend's bed. That's where it's the quietest. Um, Thank you for joining me. How are you holding up right now,
I'm happy
Brand?
to finally see you.
I
It's
know.
been a while, and we were supposed to meet in a couple of weeks in real life, so I feel like this is a treat.
Yeah, it's I still feel bitter about that not happening because that was like my vacation slash work thing. That's not gonna happen at all this year.
It
So
will happen next year.
well, yeah, next year there's always next year. We'll probably be walking around with face mask or whatever, but it'll still be really cool. So like, how are things? How are you doing during social distancing and self isolation or whatever?
I think I'm doing okay. I'm doing okay. I can't really complain.
That's good. I mean, um so I just want to get right into it because Instagram only gives us an hour before it kicks off. So I read what you emailed me, and it's really interesting, like how you break down like all of the different chapters and what you have going on in them. And when your book, I am not good with French at all, and I'm not going to even try to invest myself. So if you would mind giving the English and French title of your book so people know.
Well, the French title is Le Regard Féminin, which is basically the translation of the female gaze.
So that's it. And I feel like, especially like within the last 2 years, people have been acting like the female gaze is something that's new.
Hmm.
I just think now there's a proper term for it, as opposed to like, oh, this woman directed this movie and it's about women or whatever. But yeah, people are acting like it's this new thing. It's not fucking new. Just like watch movies by women and maybe you might get it. Not that every female director shoots from the female gaze, because there are many who don't.
Yeah.
A big one who I always know was Catherine Bigelow, who
Yeah.
is a great director, but female gaze is not her thing.
Exactly.
Right? So when you talk about the female gaze, how do you personally define what that is? Because I know what it is. What you think?
I think the female gaze is when a male or female director wants to portray the point of view of a female protagonist or a protagonist that identifies as being female. And I think the main difference for me is that we start feeling with the female protagonist instead of looking at her. And so for me, there's a physicality to that gaze. It's not a gaze that puts you at a distance from women. It's a gaze that actually brings you into their body, into their mind. And yeah, I guess that would be, for me, the main definition would be, yeah, to bring, the point of view of a female protagonist and make the audience feel what she's going through with her mind and her body.
Do you think that when you talk about like distance, what do you mean?
I think that a lot of women are filmed literally at a distance. I think that the camera is always far away from their bodies, and we're always looking at them as beautiful objects. And one way of doing that is always making sure that we don't get too close to them, so that we can at the same time see them as a fetish and demonize them, right? Because they're always going to be the other with a big O. And so I think when I was writing my book, what really struck me was that the movies that I was seeing where I was experiencing female gaze, there were actually, the directors were using specific cinematic techniques to bring us closer to the directors. And I think, like, when I was trying to research, okay, when did this female gaze start, and I was going through the, you know, like history of films, and I was in the 30s and the 20s. And then I went all the way back to Alice Guy, who is the first women filmmaker ever. And she's also the first person who decides that that movies can be made to tell fictional stories and not just documentaries. And when I was watching her movies, there was one that really struck with me, which is like the one with a woman who is pregnant and who is putting things in her mouth and experiencing a lot of pleasure putting things in her mouth. And I was researching that specific movie that was done in 1906, and I realized that Alice Guy invented the close-up for that movie. That means that literally, to make us feel like the pleasure that her protagonist was going through, she took the camera and brought it closer to a face. And that was the first time somebody ever did that, to bring like drama to the close-up. And I think that's such, you know, it seems like so easy, but it's such a brilliant idea that we need to move the physical body of the camera to get closer to the experiences of your protagonist. And when it's a women's experience, well, because this film today and cinema has always been the movies that we still have are done by men, who most of them are just not interested in the female experience, and they're just more interested in looking at women as objects. So it's very striking to me that the directors, male or female, who want to capture that experience are always inventing things with the camera to get closer to the protagonist.
Now, when you talk about like, you mentioned film criticism also kind of operates at the distance that you described. Do you mean like, what do you mean by that? I was curious because like, I hope I'm not doing that, but you know, you never know. You know,
I think, I don't know, I feel like I was taught that to be a good film critic, you needed to know your history, you needed to know the movies that came before, you needed to understand the references in the movie, and you needed to understand the lineage that was happening. And there was this very intellectual link basically between myself and the movie, and I had to basically mobilize my mind and my knowledge to talk about movies. And I did that for a long time. And when I was doing research for this book, I realized that I had to let go of this dichotomy between the mind and the body. And why would the mind be more important than what I was feeling physically? And I realized that most of the things that we feel at the movies have been devalued. So like when you cry at the movies, you're a sissy. You know, it's like you're supposed to be ashamed as a critic if you like cry in front of other critics. You're supposed to have this distance between yourself and the screen. And I don't agree with that. And I think that's, you know, who decided that? I think that being moved physically by a movie is one of the most important things, and to feel it in your flesh is an experience. And I feel like that is a valid way of talking about the cinematic experience, and it doesn't have to be all intellect.
do you think that that's like a hard and fast French thing, or do you think that that's like the international sort of or a Western sort of way when operating?
I think it's, well, I guess I read mainly critics from French and American critics, so I'm not sure about other countries or tradition, but I definitely think this is a very French tradition, where also, you know, France has given so much great film criticism and great books about what film criticism is. And I feel like you are taught these texts and you feel indebted to these texts, and it's hard to start thinking in a different way when all of your mentors are doing kind of the same thing, and that is part of a tradition, and you want to feel accepted, I think, in those schools of thoughts, because there really are schools of thought in France about the way you talk as a critic. For example, you can never use I will never use before, I would never use I. Like I would never say I think or I feel or my point of view is. And I think that in the States, but maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I'm reading is that I feel like the American critics can talk about from their own point of view, and that there's nothing to be ashamed to be like, I am speaking as a feminist woman, for example, you know? And I feel like that in France, at least that's I'm getting a lot of criticism because of that. But I think it's about time that we embrace that when we're watching a movie, we're not detached from our own history, you know, and from what is making our own identity. And yeah, so that subjectivity that we're supposed to have as a film critic in France, I think is actually not doing a service to the industry, because I feel like since most of the people that are film critics in France are white males, we're getting a lot of what white males think about movies, and they're pretending that's being, you know, objective, but it's not. We're all talking from a point of view, and I think that should be something that's seen as positive, as rich, you know, like and once we realize that, then we realize all the voices that are missing. And I think the idea of the argument that we should be, you know, at a distance when we're criticizing a movie, I think that's bullshit. I think that's a way of not seeing all the people who are not telling us what they see.
What I can say for like my journey and how it's gone as far as like here in America is I never entered this thing in a traditional way. I've always been, at the beginning, I didn't really have any training, so I was always allowed to write what I wanted to write. It wasn't until, you know, the last few years that I discovered that every website requires a different thing. Like, you know, some websites send you, you know, their style guide or whatever. But it wasn't until I started writing for trades that it was like, okay, so we don't use we don't do this, we don't do that. The whole format of we write things, as opposed to how I naturally would write things. Sometimes I can put I, and sometimes I don't. And it really just depends on what type of outlet you're writing for. I can be more passionate at, I don't know, smaller outlets or whatever is not considered a trade, then if I was writing a trade, then I have to, you know, focus on the movie, and whatever passion I have to rewrite and redirect that in another way. And, you know, people want that, they want to attain that, they want bylines, but the formats are very different. And I've learned a lot along the way. And, you know, there's still not enough critics of color or women. The numbers are still low on both. And you notice the difference in how women absorb content as opposed to how men absorb it and stuff like that. I always use the example of the Birds of Prey film, Harley Quinn, the new film. You know, there was Kathy Yan was the director, and everything was really shot from the female gaze. However, other critics and just men in general thought there was like this political feminist Nazi agenda to take whatever, and Harley Quinn's not sexy enough and this and that. And it's like, okay, well, the previous movie that Harley Quinn was in, The Suicide Squad, was directed by a man, and it was very male gazing, and it was very, you know, to attract the attention of men and men who read comic books. What I think people ignored is that if we're talking about physical appearance in this new movie, that she's wearing less clothing, but because people see it as like this feminist thing, they didn't really notice just the physical aspects. The story, of course, is very women-centric and shot from a women's focus, but it's just interesting that people turn their attentions to when it comes time for women to write and shoot and direct women. It's just really It's really interesting. Another example, well, I'll get to that later because I want to talk about why I hate Blue is the Warmest Color. I I hate that movie. I made a list recently about films that I hate, like from the depths of my soul, and Blue is the Warmest Color is one of them. But I'm gonna wait till I get to that. But I know you talked about in your second chapter the female gaze and like female directors who you talk about, Elise Guy and Jane Champon
Camp. Yeah.
and Celine Sciamma. Can you talk a little bit about that and why they're the directors, some of the directors you chose?
Yeah. I had this chapter about how the female gaze is shaping a new aesthetic of desire. And I really wanted to write about La Leçon de Piano, so the piano lesson by Jane Campion. And my book was almost finished and was supposed to come in September. And then I went to Cannes and I saw Celine Sciamma's movie. And so then I had to call my publisher and say, I need to rewrite my book. And I need to rewrite this chapter. So my book got pushed back and I started rearranging a lot of things because I felt like Portrait of a Lady on Fire, Jane Campion's movie, and Alice Guy's movie were all showing the way that we can experience desire without going through domination. And that seems like a very simple idea, but once again, it's quite revolutionary because we're so used to seeing desire through domination and through one character dominating the other, that when you actually see things through a gaze that is putting forward what equality is, and that desire can rise from seeing the person in front of you as an equal, I think that in itself could change the world, you know? And definitely when you're talking about, you know, I think also what was interesting to me with those directors is that I also felt that they were addressing their movie to us and that they were looking at us as equals. What I mean by that is that when I'm watching those movies, I never feel trapped. I don't feel like I want to, you know, you're talking about Blue is the Warmest Color. I remember watching that movie and wanting to get out and feeling trapped, you know, like the director has this power over you and is not generous with you. He's imposing his vision. And I feel like with this aesthetic of desire that's about equality, the same thing happens between us and the movie. That means that when I'm watching the movie, I know that the director is thinking about me and is respecting me and is inclusive of me. And I really felt that super strongly at Cannes last year with Portrait of a Lady on Fire, because, for example, when the male character appears and you start laughing because you basically forget that men exist. I feel like that's the director winking at us in the audience. You know, that means that there is already a link that is, you know, implicit, but there is a link between her and us, and that means that she's acknowledging that we're there, and I think that that's super powerful. Because it changes the way I feel like for so long directors have been seen and have been using their power to be, you know, this like God basically that can do whatever they want on their sets and outside of their sets. And I think that it's super powerful when all of a sudden you feel like the director enjoys the relationship that they have with their audience and respects their audience and thinks of their audience as intelligent people, you know, and I think that's rare, and it was super moving to me. And I think also, to come back to the discussion of like the body, that makes it it becomes an embodied experience, right? Because knowing that the director is acknowledging the people watching the movie makes you more present in the room. And so you stop being a passive viewer and you become an active viewer, and you're participating in watching. And then, you know, the screen becomes this skin. There is a tactile quality to the cinematic experience that happens for me through the female gaze.
And do you think this reasoning is why maybe Portrait of a Lady on Fire didn't do as well at first in France, and why there were all of these complaints from, you know, old white guys saying that
I mean,
connected.
I remember
there was nothing political.
I remember that day so clearly, and I remember, you know, what happens right in Cannes is that you see the movie, then you write about it, and then the next day or in the next couple of hours, everybody's critic is out. And I remember seeing what other people were writing in France and seeing what people were writing for the American media, and just being so shocked by what people in France had seen. And I felt like we had not seen the same movie.
Right.
And you know, so the people that were, I mean, a lot of at first in Cannes, a lot of the French film critics were saying that the movie lacked flesh, that it was not sexy, not erotic enough. And that really made me question how their gaze was formed by other movies and the expectations that they had about what a sexy movie was, or what, you know, filming flesh was. And it kind of made me sad, because it just shows how all of these things are so integrated within us that it's very difficult, right, to think about filming desire in a way that you haven't seen before. And I think that what happened is that most of the critics had not seen desire filmed that in that way before, and they didn't recognize it because that's not part of their lives as critics, or maybe their lives at all, I don't know. But for me, there was something that was not connecting for them. And I think it's because they just aren't used to being put in this place of sharing the female experience and sharing a desire that's not going to be built through domination.
You're a lot nicer in your explanation than I was when I initially found out. I was like, okay, so everybody over here is a bunch of fucking perverts, and all they want TNA, you know, and they don't understand and don't want to be open-minded about other ways of watching and viewing it and internalizing cinema. And I know a lot of that has to do with the dinosaurs of this industry who are still around and still judge films based on they don't go any deeper, at least in my opinion. They don't want to go deeper. They just want everything sort of given to them, and they don't want to interpret or think for themselves because they feel like that should be all laid out for them. And there needs to be younger and more diverse critics. I don't know what the industry in France looks like. I'm pretty sure there's very little to none, like people of color or, you know, Black women or whatever writing about this stuff.
I know one.
You know one. Wow. Okay.
Of course.
There's one. Not that there's a whole bunch here either, but to say that there's still more is
I mean, I should say one in a major publication, because of course those voices are out there. I'm just talking, I know one that's like in a major newspaper, you know.
Yeah, there aren't that many here either. I mean, a lot of us are freelancing, and as you know, with what's happened now, a lot of freelance budgets have dried. Most of us are sort of this sort of winging it, but
I think, you know, you're right in saying that. I think they're being lazy, for sure, but I also think that they feel deeply threatened. I really think that there is, that they're afraid of these types of movies.
Mm-hmm.
because it's one thing to kind of like not get a movie, but it's another thing to reject a movie. And I think whenever there's a piece of writing or of a movie that's just being rejected, it says something about them. It doesn't say, it's not about the movie. It says something about them and them being threatened by something that maybe they don't understand quite yet. But it's there's something visceral there. Once again, it's the body being attacked for them. They feel attacked, and I think they need to question why they don't see it or why they feel attacked by it and what it means,
And I feel like they even in West, like here in America, like films always have to. It seems like there always has to be like what's the word I'm looking for? Like trauma, like something bad has to happen to these female protagonists for the film to be impactful for them. If there's no tits and there's no ass, is somebody dying? Is somebody being raped? Are they being beaten almost to death or tortured or something for their love or whatever? And when you have films that don't have any of that, they don't know how to process it. And then once they move on from that criteria, they're like, okay, so what is inherently political about this film? Does it have a message that is outside of love or whatever? And when you don't have that, then that's when I think the confusion for them comes in, and they're like, well, what is the importance of this? It's just about love or women or whatever. There's nothing inherently political, but because men are so caught up in patriarchy and in their own bullshit, they don't realize that a lot of these films are about their dominance and how, like a film like Portrait of a Lady, I find inherently political, because while there are no men there, you feel the weight of patriarchy throughout the 2 hours. But I don't know how anybody didn't catch that, or talk about other subjects that come up in the film. It's like, so this is like super political, because equality among women is a political thing, right?
But one of the chapters in my book is just about rape. You just mentioned, violence against women.
I was going to get into that.
Yeah, because I think that what was really striking to me when I was doing research also is that basically the rape narrative has been part of American cinema since the beginning. And there are lots, there's like the main book about this is called Watching Rape. But I realized that in the hundreds of movies that are cited in this book, Watching Rape, almost none are portraying rape through the female experience of the woman going through the rape. And that's really insane when you think about it, because movies portray so much violence, and we've been so used to seeing women's bodies being violated, but however, this experience is almost never seen through the protagonist's experience and bodily experience. And I think I think a lot of people I know don't like Handmaid's Tale, and I'm not a huge fan of the TV series. But what I will say is that it is the first time that you see numerous rapes almost in every episode that are always seen through the women's perspective. And the main character, Alfred or June, goes through all of these states, and you're with her, you're in her head, you listen to what she's saying to herself. The camera is following her bodily movements. And a lot of people say, well, that's the most violent thing I've seen. I hate that movie. It's like, that TV series is so traumatizing. But nobody will ever say that of a Game of Thrones episode, People will rejoice in the violence that they see in a Game of Thrones episode. But watching rape through the point of view of the woman is something that is like too violent for our society. When it's used as like a titillating device, then everybody is like, oh, that's fine, and that's not rape. But it is rape, and it's just not shown from the women's point of view. And I think that's like one of the main things we need to talk about as well, is how violence against women is being portrayed in film and TV series.
A film that I can think of that I remember taking that has a rape in it, that takes place from the female's perspective, trigger warning, is a movie called The Accused with Jodie Foster. It's an old movie, and I remember everything sort of being from her perspective, and I remember having this very visceral reaction. That wasn't necessarily, it was violent, of course, but I just remember feeling a sort of connection. I was internalizing it, where a film like Irreversible by Gaspar Noé, who just created, I mean, all his films, he hates women, clearly. And all his films are about violence against women. And Irreversible, with the 15-minute long rape scene and all of this violence and trauma, it took me out of the film, because I was like, okay, so this is like overboard, and this is clearly coming from a personal place and not rooted in, okay, well, I'm not just not rooted in realism, but this is meant to like shock the audience out the door, as opposed to trying to get across like a message. And actually, what's funny is you talk about Paul Verhoeven.
Yeah.
I'm assuming you're talking about Strict Showgirls?
No, I'm actually talking about Elle.
Oh God. Ugh, another movie that.
Okay, so stay with me on this movie, okay? Because what's really interesting so if you haven't seen Elle, I don't want to spoil everything, but it starts with a woman who's played by Isabelle Huppert, and she is raped in her house. And at some point in the movie, she discovers who raped her, and she decides to have a relationship with her rapist. So just pitching it like that is like problematic, right? But if you're just looking at, I was just looking at the way the rape scenes were filmed, and the rape scenes are always filmed through her perspective or the cat's perspective, so a neutral perspective. And I thought that really was interesting to me, because it was problematizing the whole interaction. Because even though there's nothing realistic about this story, I still felt like his camera stayed with this woman's body and her mind and her fantasy, even though it can make us feel very uncomfortable. I still thought that that was an interesting point of view, and it's something that I had never seen before. And I'm not saying that it's a movie that I love, but I did feel like he was really thinking about how he was filming it and what perspective he was giving. And it's the same thing, you know, there's a rape also in Showgirls. And it is from the women's perspective, and it's extremely violent. It's an extremely violent rape scene, but she's never objectified in the scene. We're with her and we're getting beaten up with her, and we're going through that horrendous violence. It's like, you know, it's the type of scene where you could almost start vomiting. And I think for me that is still the female gaze, because it's staying with the women's experience, even if it's not a realistic experience. It's a cinematic experience, and we're with her during it.
And when you talk about, like, especially, and it's interesting how Hollywood specifically decided to subvert this rape thing with the rape revenge genre, which Almighty Aphrodite in the comments brought up, is that this subgenre of rape revenge, which is supposed to be about like liberated heroines, which you talk about in your book, but it's supposed to give us the idea that these women are liberated and are taking back but it's still male gazing. When you look at stuff like I Spit on Your Grave, or Coralie Farge,
Farjas, yeah, yeah.
Farge, Revenge.
Yes.
Where you look at it and it's like, well, okay, this is why are first of all, why are these films being like marketed as like revenge movies for the Me Too era?
Yeah, no, that's super problematic.
And
But
then
I do, yeah.
and then you have like, you know, Revenge was a film that really surprised me because it was marketed as this Me Too revenge story. And it wasn't even about really revenge. It was this woman who was trying to not get killed by her rapist. And so it was like, you know, and everything was sort of, I guess it's seen technically from her perspective in some ways. But I was shocked to see like a woman who directed this very male heavy film. I don't know.
I mean, I think that the genre of rape and revenge is super interesting. I actually read a book about it that was like really great. I can't remember the author's name, but I cite her in my book. Um, and I, for example, I rewatched a movie called Baise-moi by Virginie Despentes, and the title in English is not Fuck Me. It's I can't remember, but I thought that, for example, looking at that movie through the genre perspective of rape and revenge was super interesting. And so I think it really, it's first of all, it's interesting in itself that there is this genre, right? Because it's as if it's the only way of portraying rape in an acceptable way is if we see the woman killing the guy who raped her. But I feel like right now with the TV series Unbelievable, there has been some sort of shift. I don't know if you've seen it, but I feel like for the first time, it wasn't about getting revenge. It was just about the rape and the trauma of the rape and how it just can fuck you up for years. And it's not something that's just gonna end at the end of the penetration. It's something that's gonna stay and stick to your body for a really long time. And when I was doing research about rape, I saw this Ida Lupino movie that was shot in 1950 called Outrage that I had never heard of before. And it's just about the post-traumatic stress of this woman who is raped one night, and it's in the 1950s, you know, and it's like it's an hour and a half of just her processing what happened to her. And it's super contemporary when you watch this because you realize, well, almost no movie spends time with a woman after she's been through this. And I really think all of those experiences are lacking because rape is something that has become that happens to so many women. It is a pandemic, you know, and we don't discuss violence against women and what happens to their bodies and what happens to their psyche. And I do think we need more representations of it through the female gaze and not the male gaze, to stop making it an erotic experience like in Game of Thrones. I always go back to Game of Thrones, but they portray it as if it's a fucking erotic experience that should turn us on. This is like a disaster for me. I'm not saying that they're bad or good ways of representing certain acts, but we really need more representations of rape through the female gaze to understand what is actually happening is that you're treating a person as an object. And that is just not okay. And it should be represented in that way.
Another film that actually, there's two films that I can think of. The first is The Nightingale by Jennifer Kent. And while the film is not great, in my opinion, I went into the film thinking it was rape revenge, but I came out of the film realizing that it was about a film about recovering from trauma of rape and death. And I thought that was really interesting, and it made me like the film a little bit more. I just wish it wasn't marketed as rape revenge, because then I went in expecting one thing and then came out getting something else. And at first it felt underwhelming until I had to sit and process it.
So I don't know if you followed this whole controversy that I've been having with Roman Polanski's films. But I also teach film, I've decided that I wasn't gonna teach films from directors that are accused of rape. And so I stopped teaching Roman Polanski's movies because 12 women are accusing him of rape. And I mean, one would be enough, obviously, but I mean, at some point, I'm saying this because Polanski's last movie got so much money to be made in France, and you know, he won Best Director at the César, which is our Oscar ceremony. And so yeah, I don't want to spend time talking about men who rape women.
Woody Allen's movie was doing far better than Portrait at the time. I think it was something Manhattan, some shit of something of the name of the movie or whatever was doing like way better. And I just don't understand. One of the things that I've been trying to understand, what, you know, by speaking with you and other people who are French and in the French film industry, what is it in this society, in this industry, that people are okay with putting rapists on a pedestal and going against, and women who are going against their own self-interest and getting behind these people because art means more than your feelings. And I just don't understand it at all. And I know I read the New York Times article with Adele Chanel talked about how France got on the Me Too movement a little too late. I mean, is it going anywhere? Like, I know the Women's March was you know, last month, and like that. I just don't know. I know what it has meant for America. And the, you know, and the sort of cancel culture that's happening. But people in France are speaking out. It doesn't seem like anything is happening. Now, I could be wrong because I don't live there. I'm not from there.
I mean,
you know, we know why. We understand Adele is a woman of privilege and power. So she is able to have the police investigate her case. But what about everybody else? Like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean, I think there is a cultural thing that is very strong in France about this so-called tradition of separating the man from the art. And I think, you know, it goes back to the question of what is threatening the people that are resisting to hearing what the women have to say. Because women have been speaking, they're just not being heard. And the media also has not been really giving them the voice or the space so that the voice can be read by other people. And there's a problem with education. There's a problem with the way we perceive male artists in France. And we also have a very big judicial problem, right? Because only one case of rape out of 100 will be treated in France by the justice and get to the man being condemned. So, and those are the numbers we have with the women who actually already go to the police, right? So it's like, who fucking knows? But we know as women, as French women, that the justice won't protect us, the police won't protect us, the media won't protect us, and the whole society will tell you that you should be happy to be seduced by men, right? Because that's like when the Me Too movement happened in the States, we had, right, in Le Monde, Catherine Deneuve, a French actress, and many others signing this tribute saying that they wanted to have the right to be basically seduced by men, importuné in French. And that is very problematic.
Seduced, but I don't understand what that means. What do you mean seduced, like to be seduced?
They say that they don't want to live in a society where men can't I'm quoting them, seduce women, because they think that all of this is part of a seduction game, that it's, and you know, the women who sign this are very powerful women, but they're also extremely, they're older women, they're white women, they're privileged women, and
They're
it's
all
as if,
jaded.
and but it's like, it's crazy. I think that, I really think that when this came out in France, all the women who were about to speak went back to being silenced, because the powerful women were saying, we don't believe you, and we think that in France seduction is our national right. And that is so insane. Like, that is it is insane. I understand when I'm saying it out loud how crazy it must sound, but this is part of our heritage and our culture, and our literary culture that comes a lot from the 18th century, and what people view as like yeah, as seduction is not seduction. It's when you know, it's not about consent in France. It's, you know, even the word consent is like super problematic. So yeah, I don't even know where to start.
The word feminism is like seen as a bad thing.
Yeah, feminism is seen as a bad thing. The word you know, rape doesn't really exist, abuse doesn't really exist, like all of these things that, because we really need to be able to name these things so that they exist, right? And so saying that abuse is seduction is 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 so violent, and it's so problematic, because it's not allowing those words to exist in the public space. So how do you name something when you are when that word is not even existing and is taken away from you? And I think that's, yeah.
It's really interesting because, you know, anybody that says anything like that here, you know, when we look at, as an American, when I look at Europe, I think of progression, progressiveness. I think about, you know, universal health care and social services for everybody. And then, you know, and it wasn't until I started getting into this, it wasn't until I met Celine Sciamma that I started realizing that things are not, the grass is not always greener on the other side.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
was like hugely disappointed by the way things went with the film, and then people being nasty after Adele came out about her, what happened with her and Christophe Rougia, and just it. I mean, it's like the fucking Wild West over there. Like, people are nasty. Like, at least here, and I'm not trying to make any comparison, but I know at least here you can speak up and will, even if the cops or anybody doesn't believe you, the social media, they will sort of uplift your voice and say, this is what's happening, you know. But there, it's like you have some of the most powerful women who are like, feminism is bad.
Well, yeah, they're patriarchal women. I mean, most women who have power in France are patriarchal women. But I also think that it goes back to the question of what's being represented. And my previous book, I wrote about how women's sexuality is being represented in American TV series. And in France, people were like, why are you looking at American television to talk about sex? You know, like, the French were like so much more like cool and like, you know, progressive. And it's like, no, we're not. What we're portraying is a patriarchal view of what sexuality is. And it's always the fucking same thing with the same people. And it is not interesting. And that's why, even if I'm writing in French and I'm writing from a French perspective, I'm always looking at what's happening in the States, because it is, in terms of feminism and representations, the States have been really much more in advance than what we have in France in 2020, you know, apart from Portrait of a Lady on Fire, of course, but, and, you know, that's interesting that there is this exception that was able to come to us, but most of the movies and most of the TV series that we see are portraying sexuality through domination without looking at women's experience, without understanding that consent can be sexy and you can actually portray consent in an interesting way. None of this is happening on our screens in France. And so, of course, like when Portrait of a Lady comes out, we don't understand why nobody is seeing the same thing as we are. But it's because the whole culture is retarded and is like literally in the past. And you also need to understand that even the word gender, so genre in French, is still a controversial notion in France. You see, people don't understand that you can look at art or society and think in terms of gender. They don't understand the concept. It just does not exist in French vocabulary.
You know, actually that leads me to the next point where you talk about in your 4th chapter, which is about female sexual pleasure. And this is where I'm going to get into talking about blue is the warmest color. Okay. Now I saw Blue is the warmest color recently. I didn't see it when it came out. I saw it last year for the first time. Because I had already seen Portrait of a Lady on Fire, and everybody was like, oh, blue is the warmest color, it's this other one, and people were making some comparisons, and I was like, okay, well, let me check this out. And then I started to remember back to when we were doing like the whole press thing for Blue is the Warmest Color, and how Lisa Seydoux was unhappy, and like everybody was just not getting along. And then the information started to come out about how difficult the process was, and the different things that the director made them do, and not having closed sets like they thought, and just the abuse that went on behind the scenes, not even in front. But you have, what was interesting about it was that it's still, you have these two women, the relationship still comes from a place of top and bottom, or as you would say, domination, where you have these two people who just basically abuse one another back and forth. And we have these 15-minute sex scenes that are supposed to, I mean, I don't know what they were supposed to do. I know it made me feel disgusted, and I had to watch the movie in like sections, like a TV show, like a miniseries. I was like, I'll just watch 1 hour, and I'll just come back the next day and then watch another hour. Because I didn't want to feel that restriction that you were talking about before.
Yeah.
Because it's a film that definitely made me feel trapped and small and heavy. And I just, all the screaming and yelling and all that stuff, it's just not a good movie. I know that director has problems with gays, and I don't know if, I don't even remember his name, but I'm like, does he know any women? Does he know any lesbians? Because his films are just like whatever. Like, you know, I know he had a film at Cannes last year that was like 4 hours of women shaking their ass and shit. And I'm like, I'm glad that, because when I saw the name, I was like, oh hell no, he directed Blue is the Warmest Color. I'm fucking out of here.
Yeah.
But you know, that film, Blue is the Warmest Color, received so much more critical acclaim from France and in America, and it was sent to the Oscars and all of this shit. And you know, people always want to know why I think the movie sucks. Because I just say it sucks and I don't explain it. But it's a very violent experience. One that not like something that I would see as, how do I say this? The fact that I couldn't escape it, where I watch a film like Irreversible and I can take myself out of it because I find all of these different reasons and excuses for why I can't connect with that, then it's a film that sometimes pulls me in moments, and then I'm trying to retreat, and then I'm forced back into the story, and then I'm retreating, and it's like this push and pull, and films that are like that don't do it for me.
Yeah.
It was emotional terrorism. That's, I
Yeah.
know that's like a strong term, but it was stressful, and I don't like dominant stuff like that where I'm fucking stressed out and I can't even experience what's happening because I'm, my body is doing all of these different
Well, I
things
mean,
while.
thank God you didn't watch the last movie in Cannes. It was like one of the most, first of all, they showed us the movie. They showed it to the journalists, the film critics, at around 11 p.m. So we had to stay until 2 a.m.
Oh no!
And then the movie wasn't completely finished, so the color grading wasn't done yet. And I remember going. I was kind of stressed out going in, and something very interesting happened is that all the male critics that I work with, they all sat together, and all the women who work in the same journal, we were left to sit behind them. Like they didn't, usually you keep each other like, seats next to you, and it's very cliquish, but, and so I was like, oh, interesting. Like all the women are being like behind. And the movie started, and I was realizing that there was a gender. I'm not saying that all the male in the room were enjoying this, but definitely the 10 boys in front of me were having a great time watching this movie that is only happening in a nightclub with like, I mean, I don't, if you see like, when like when the music is so loud in a nightclub, but at least you're drunk and you're dancing, so it's okay. But when you're not drunk and not dancing and sitting and you have to watch it, there is something that is close to torture to my mind. And seeing women that were just like this objectified, there is like an oral sex scene, a guy giving oral sex to a woman that is shot for several minutes. I think it was 15 minutes. And I felt like I felt like she was being tortured. I was like, this is horrible.
So that was supposed to be a version of female pleasure. Okay, so we're about to get cut off. So
yeah.
When it cuts us off, I'm going to go live again, and you can join again.
Okay.
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 Because I want to get questions as well. Actually, let's end. I'm going to end now, and then I'm going to go back live.
Okay.
Like 1 second. Okay.
Okay.
Me? We got cut off. I'm sorry, we got cut off. I don't know what happened.
It's okay.
I'm sorry, what were you saying?
I was saying that he doesn't film the men in his films the same way he films women's. Like if everybody was treated equally and filmed as an ass, then it would be a statement. But what is disturbing to me is that that treatment is only for women. His male characters always have their pants on, their shirts on, and are just never filmed naked.
True. And then you have like this, when you talk about female desire and his version of what female desire is, as opposed to the reality of, men have a really interesting view of what they think women do, especially lesbians. They think that all lesbians are just scissoring each other away all the time, and that's all we do. But it's not like that when I think of a film like Atomic Blonde, for example, which is revolutionary in its own way, I guess, by being like this, this huge Bond-esque film featuring Charlize Theron, who's at the center.
Yeah.
But, you have this female, you have this woman-on-woman relationship that's not that doesn't come from a place of realism at all. And I've gotten into arguments about that from other lesbians, and I'm like, what makes you think that something like that is realistic to a woman who identifies, or, you know, to a woman who identifies as lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, or whoever, women who love women. It's just really interesting how men view women's pleasure from their own point of view.
Yeah.
So weird.
But for me, for me, the question is not so much, is it realistic or not? The problem is that we always get the same perspective, and we always get this male gaze onto women's sexuality. So it's like, for me, it's always a perspective. And it's also, I really don't think that they're that interested. I think that they're interested in showing us their projection and their fantasy and what they imagine, but they're not that interested in showing what it actually feels like.
No, not even a little bit are they interested in showing that at all. And I guess their version of really good examples of I think where there's like female desire that is palpable is like Carol, for example, which is directed by Todd Haynes. Todd Haynes is a gay male, and
yeah.
I wonder if that helps at all. But it was a really good American film.
Yeah.
It's not perfect, but it did a really good job in showing the buildup of desire and how it just doesn't happen after, how women who love meet each other and the next day they're moving in. That's not how that works.
Yeah.
Or it's not how that always works. But that works for some. And to the last point before I get to questions is when you talk about liberated heroines, and you mentioned Agnes Varda. When you talk about like liberated heroines, what does that mean for you?
Yeah. What it means to me is that they can circulate, and that they can circulate freely. And I think that the fact that their bodies are moving bodies that have autonomy and that can, it sounds like, when I say it out loud, I'm like, wow, this is like, I'm actually saying that it's great to see women walking around, but it kind of is, that's
right.
That's like, we can actually still be happy to see a woman walking, because seeing women with agency is really kind of still rare. And I think what was so striking to me in, Cléo de Saint-Cassette and Agnes Varda's movie at that time, it's in 1962, is that while all the guys from the Nouvelle Vague, from the New Wave, are filming women as objects of desire, she's actually going to film a protagonist who is going to transform within the 90 minutes of the film, and who's going to go from being this like beautiful object to being a subject. And there's one particular scene that happens midway, when actually Cléo goes to see one of her friends, Dorothée, who is posing nude for other people who are sculpting her. This is the first time when Varda decides to have a point of view shot from Cléo's perspective, and you actually enter the room through her gaze and her eyes. And her friend is never objectified, even though she's naked and even though she's being painted by all of these men watching. That's not what Varda films. She films two girlfriends meeting up and driving away in a convertible car. And, that says it all, because at the time, the other filmmakers and the male filmmakers are just filming women as beautiful objects. And so that's what I mean by liberated, is that it's these women who decide to step out, to literally step out also of patriarchy. And some of them die because of it. Most of those women in that chapter that I talk about, they have like tragic endings because it is dangerous to step out and to start walking.
It's when you talk about that, it's interesting because that can apply to different types of gazes too. When we talk about when we look at Black cinema and how the closer your connection in a film, sometimes the closer your connection is to Blackness and Black people, could mean tragedy for you. Or the closer you are to being a free, sort of liberated person, then tragedy strikes, because society is such that those who are marginalized can't be liberated under that system. And so it's interesting when looking at that film, how it's a woman sort of going about her day and all of these things that happen to her. And I really like that kind of storytelling where you have a person and here's the scenario and here's how they deal with it. So I always really like that kind of storytelling. As far as liberated women, I think like
it's complicated because in French the term that I use is déchaîné, and it's actually, I'm using in this chapter, I am using the word marginalisé, right? It's the women that are always at the margin, that are always like at that limit, and that just decide to go to the other side, just at the frontier, right? What it means to be just at that place when you go the other side, what happens, right? And that liminal place, and I think that's it's complicated to translate that word, but I guess that's, it's not liberated in a sense where they're just like so at ease with their sexuality. It's that they are liberating themselves from a patriarchal cage and they're stepping outside of that. But and when you talk, about, at the end of the book, I just touch upon Bell Hook's oppositional gaze. I don't know if you've read her text about that, but I find it so interesting. And the idea of this oppositional gaze, has been with me since I've read that text of presenting something that will show you a different side of an experience, and that will open your eyes onto something that maybe you're not aware of.
There's her book about that, and I'm really bad with names and titles, but I know there are a couple of books out there about the queer gaze as well. That I've read, and I think it's important to at least have basic knowledge of all these different perspectives. And I think that's what's missing, particularly from film criticism, is there are all of these people who think they know what they're writing about, and they think they especially, white males, because it's so white male dominated, so it's a bunch of people who think they know what they're looking at because they've watched so much cinema that they just, they don't need to be, have an experience that can add to it. But I think that's what is great about the new generation of film critics in America, especially those people of color, because when we watch something, we bring an added layer of context to experience. Black cinema will come out and you'll have white critics using words like ghetto and, ghetto fabulous and this and that. And it's like, okay, well, no, you don't know what you're talking about. And so many of them are bitter and angry that there is this pushback against tradition.
I was discussing, the TV show, I know you've been watching it too, Little Fires Everywhere. And I was having a conversation with Amandine Gay, who, as you know, is a director. And Amandine is doing a documentary about adoption. And so that was really her perspective on the TV series. And I have a child, and I gave birth like 5 months ago, and I think I've been, so the TV series for me was more about what it means to be a mother, and is it really about the physicality of giving birth? And we were both coming at it, you know, from very different perspectives. And I was like, this is exactly what criticism should be about. It's because our lives are different. We see things differently, and we're not going to have the same perspective. We're not going to see the scenes in the same way. And that's why it would be really interesting to read a text from her and to read a text from me, because we are not going to talk about the same things. And I feel like in France still that's not being recognized as something that's like valid. And we need, you know, I think in the States, because especially in TV series we're getting different perspectives, then we need to have on the other spectrum and on the other side critics that are able to understand what perspectives are being shown, and also to be able to recognize that, you know, as a white woman, I might not understand the same thing as a Black woman, and I might not see the same or understand the same things in a TV show or in a film. And that's okay, you know? And it's what's not okay is that I'm not hearing the other side, and that I have no idea, you know, what's going through that critic's mind because she's not being published.
And I think like, you know, it's good that you have like different types of movies out. Like, Rafiki is another film, from, I believe, from Kenya, that's, you know, about two queer women who are in a relationship, and that experience is going to be different than what we see in Portrait of a Lady on Fire. So, and you know, it's just going to be different. But I think people should watch both so they can see both sides. But you know, you have these people who have the same criteria and apply it to everything, and you can't fucking do that.
No, you can't.
And so I'm gonna be talking with Amandine hopefully next week. And we'll be talking about Black cinema specifically in France. We'll be talking about film and stuff, so you guys be out on the look for that. Do you have time for a few questions?
Yes, I just plugged in my phone.
What would you classify, like, do you have a metric system for like the female gaze in film, kind of like the Bechdel test, or which looks at you know, men and women on screen, or like the Kent test that looks at inclusion and diversity? Do you have your own metrics?
I don't know if I would call it metrics because I think it's complicated, but basically when I was looking at movies, my question was, do I have the point of view of the female protagonist? Am I in her experience? Is desire and pleasure portrayed not through domination, but through equality? Do I feel like there is a conscious choice of wanting to portray the female experience and not put a distance and always be with her? And I think that when, you know, what really helped me is that when I was reading Laura Mulvey, because we haven't mentioned her, but she was kind of at the start of everything in 75 when she wrote her essay on the male gaze. And she used the psychoanalytical framework to basically say that, you know, as spectators, we identify with the camera lens, and the camera lens is giving us the experience of the male protagonist who is taking pleasure in looking at women as objects. And when I was writing my book, I felt super stuck with the psychoanalytical framework. And then I started reading women who were using phenomenology in film analysis and thinking about the way we live things and we experience things with the body. And so Simone de Beauvoir, for example, is a phenomenologist. Merleau-Ponty is, but Judith Butler is as well. And being able not to think in terms of like who are we identifying with, but in terms of what do we feel and who do we feel with, was really liberating for me in order to understand what the female gaze was and to think of it as a physical experience more than an intellectual one.
That's interesting. Thank you for that. Okay, so we got some questions. We got a few. First one is, will the book be translated to English?
I hope so. I mean, it's complicated right now because I feel like that's not, the number one priority, and all the book fairs were canceled. But I would really love the book to be published at Verso, which I think is like an amazing feminist and radical publishing house. But so I'm gonna reach out to them and maybe see if they would be interested.
Okay. Let's see. The next question is, what are your thoughts on films that try and do a feminist critique of how women are seen through the male gaze, like Rebecca Zawalski's Une Fille Facile?
Facile, yeah. I think that's a very complicated movie. I've actually had a long conversation with Rebecca Zlotowski about it, and she read the book, and we had a talk about it, because I think that Rebecca Zlotowski's gaze keeps on going between the male gaze and the female gaze. I think at the same time she's objectifying Zaya, the protagonist played by Zaya, and at the same time she's trying to bring us into her experience. So I think that's like a great movie because it doesn't fall into the male gaze or the female gaze. So it's like complexifying the whole conversation. But for me, it's not female gaze.
Mm. Okay, let's see. The next question is, regarding Andrea Arnold, why not mention the rape in Red Road or Fish Tank?
Oh, I think because I wanted to talk more about the way Desire was filmed in Red Road, but yeah, I mean, yes, there's always more you can add.
There's always a bunch
And
of rapes on screen that you can pick
yeah,
from. I mean, there's so many.
yeah, I mean, yes, you can always, the thing what I found is that I didn't have that much material on my chapter about representing female pleasure from the female gaze perspective, so I actually really needed Andrea Arnold in that chapter, so I decided to put her in that chapter for that reason, and it's kind of sad.
Okay, well, there's the answer. So next question is, sorry if you already said this, but what are some of your favorite films that embody the female gaze, so I can make recommendations?
I actually have a list
like
at
five,
the end of
like
I have a list at the end of my book. Maybe I'll just publish that on Instagram. But five, we haven't talked about this, but I think Titanic is female gaze. Of course, Portrait of a Lady on Fire is female gaze. I think that Chantal Akerman's movies are female gaze. So, Je tue, il, elle, I think is a great movie to watch during this time of being stuck at home. I think Jeanne Dillman is also another great Ackerman movie to watch right now. I would say, I don't know if we haven't spoken about her, but Justine Triet, who is another French filmmaker, her movie Sibylle is really interesting. It was in Cannes last year, and it's kind of the same thing. She didn't get that much recognition, and I don't understand why. I think it's an amazing movie. But yeah, I mean, I stopped counting the names, but there's another movie that I really love that's called Simone Barbet sous la vertu. And I don't know if it's even translated, and I don't know if you can get English subtitles for that, but you can find it on YouTube. And I think that's really amazing. Yeah, those are the names that are, I think, the piano lesson by Jane Campion. Yeah.
And I'm gonna ask you one more question, and it's from Let's Be Apart. Why can't we talk about the identification process through the female gaze?
Because I think the female gaze is not about identifying. I think it's about sharing. And I think that the argument that's been made so many times also by men saying, well, I don't know how to identify with a female protagonist, which is what we've been doing as women, identifying with male protagonists throughout our lives. But I feel like we need to get out of this idea of identification and think more about sharing experiences. And for example, like when I'm watching the TV show Insecure, I don't identify as like a Black woman living in LA in her 30s, but I can sometimes really share her experience. And I'm more interested in sharing an experience than identifying with somebody. And I think that we've been so used to saying that movies are about identification. And I think we have suffered so much from not being able to identify with characters and feeling like our lives and our experiences are not being represented and suffering from that lack of identification, that if we shift that perspective, if we stop craving that identification, and if we just think about feeling with a character and being within that experience, then it opens up a lot of possibilities and a lot of ways of feeling happy about it.
And I think identity is really tricky, especially when when we are two different people like you and I. I'm not going to be able to identify with some of the things you come in contact with and vice versa. But I think I can seek some understanding and mostly support, because I think understanding and identification are very tricky and things that are more than likely going to fail because it's hard to identify. And all I can do is tell you, and all you can do is support what is happening. And I think that understanding and support is two different things, and I think it's important that people understand that they are two different things. And sometimes people are just not going to be able to identify and understand, but you can always support what they say, what they do, what's happening to them, and just believe, what people say. Like you said, the shared experience. That's the only thing that connects the two, shared experience. But that's not going to always be the case. So, thank you for this 90 minutes session. Yeah. I learned a lot from you, a lot about France and everything, and I hope you enjoyed it. Maybe we can do it again sometime while we're all indoors or whatever. But I hope that I get to meet you all in person.
I know.
I feel like not everybody, but I feel like a lot of people now know me in France, which is not something that I expected to happen. And I owe that probably to Celine.
Yeah, and Portrait Nation.
And the Portrait Nation. You take care of yourself. Make sure that your family is safe, and maybe we can do this again another time. Thanks again, and have a good night.
Bye.
Take care.
Take care of yourself. Take care.